Hello, welcome to the first episode of the Dr. Junkie Show. I'm your host, Ben Boyce. Today I want to introduce myself and talk about this project. This podcast is about things that get you high, where they come from, how they're produced, how to use them responsibly, and what happens in the body when we do. As I begin recording episodes, the COVID-19 quarantine is entering week 9 in the United States, and we are all struggling through the so-called new normal. Regardless of how rapidly a vaccine is developed, we have years of recovery ahead of us. Many will lose their jobs, their savings, their homes, and even their loved ones. And in times such as these, drug use and overdose become more common. Not because unemployed people are bad, but because work provides us with a sense of accomplishment, responsibility, fulfillment, security. Drugs can also provide many of these same feelings. When we're bored and we can't afford to go out because we don't have the cash, or because we struggle with social phobia, or because a new virus is floating around and making people sick, we often turn to the chemicals in our medicine cabinets and our sock drawers. The United States is already in the midst of a so-called opioid crisis. 65 to 70,000 people in the U.S. die from drug overdoses every year. We currently arrest somebody for a drug abuse violation every 20 seconds. Most of the cocaine and heroin on the streets is cut with hygiene products, other medications, or straight up poison added by street dealers to increase their profits. We drug users are told that our condition is a disease, but we are treated like it is a scarlet letter. When it acts up, we are met with a sinister scripted response known as tough love. This response, bottled and distributed in the generation of intervention, hangs over us addicts like a permanent threat of banishment. If your disease relapses, you will be kicked out and cut off. Across the country, our screens and speakers spew forth messages of fear and loathing concerning drugs. Damage, despondence, and death are promised to anyone who even experiments with some drugs. Meanwhile, U.S. citizens continue to spend $100 billion every year on illegal and untaxed narcotics. The fear tactics clearly aren't working. The war waged against us users makes it difficult to practice responsible use, and those of us who use drugs suffer very real consequences. The diseases that intravenous drug users sometimes acquire from our friends are the result of needle shortages and unsanitary use, not the drugs we consume. If we were using clean drugs from sanitary equipment in a safe space, diseases like hepatitis and HIV, and even abscesses and sores, would be virtually unheard of in the drug-using community. The violence that plagues communities where drugs are sold is the result of their value, which is incredibly inflated due to the war on drugs. Cocaine and heroin are worth more than gold in the United States, and they're easy to sell. Since they're illegal, robberies can't be reported, and bad batches of drugs can't be recalled by official authorities. Dealers and users must operate around the law, enforcing their own discipline. The day that cocaine and heroin are $1 per gram on the streets of the United States, every street-level drug dealer and the cartels supported by them will immediately be out of a job. And we can make this happen. Cocaine and heroin are not that expensive to produce. This isn't a difficult concept to grasp. Nobody would purchase polluted powder from a crack house when we could get bottled heroin from a clinic at a cheaper price. Yet these products remain illegal, needlessly funding all sorts of criminal activity. When we struggle with addiction or dependency, doctors are forced to cut us off and send us to the streets. Some of us just quit, but many of us find illegal dealers who know little about the drugs they sell us and stand to lose money if we ever attempt to reduce our consumption. Doctors have little incentive to keep me hooked on an ever-increasing dose of heavy opioids or cocaine, but local drug dealers always will. The only reason we discard our needles and crack pipes in public areas, in parks and on sidewalks, is because we can be charged with a crime if we're caught with them. Otherwise, we might do the responsible thing and find a safe disposal site. The list goes on and on. Any drug user will verify that I have only just begun to describe what an addict has to go through on a daily basis, all courtesy of the war on drugs. Clearly, the system was not designed to stop people from using drugs, or it would have been fixed a long time ago. It's never worked to keep people from using drugs, or to keep drugs off the street, or to minimize the danger to those of us using them. Instead, it's worked to clamp down on those who it labels, oxymoronically, as patients who have a disease, addiction, and whose symptoms involve the use of drugs. Such baloney only passes muster in the shadows of confusion. If we knew the truth about drugs and the cruel war that we're fighting against those who use them, we might find ourselves reconsidering the policies of prohibition and warfare that are responsible for 70,000 of my people, drug users, dying every single year. This podcast is about things that get you high. For far too long, the United States has pursued a policy of torture and fear. We've been waging a war against our own family members and friends for longer than most of us have been alive, and nothing has changed except our chances of survival when we struggle with addiction. Those are through the floor. In the early 1900s, when drugs were legal, addiction was just a speed bump in life. Now, 100 years into this war, it is a stigmatizing disease at best and a death sentence at worst. Our refusal to talk about the problem has allowed it to fester and metastasize to the point where we addicts are dying in droves, yet no one seems to notice anymore. You might be wondering why I am your host. What does a stuffy professor whose PhD is in communication have to say about drugs and addiction? Well, I can assure you that I have a face for podcasting, but that isn't my only reason for tackling this project now. I also have some skin in the game when it comes to the war on drugs. It's taken its pound of flesh from me. I was sentenced to 1 to 5 years in prison for drug-related crimes in 2004, and I'm lucky to have escaped the revolving door of recidivism. Nearly 80% of inmates released from prison go back within 5 years of release. I'm a junkie. That odd jump in your gut at my admission, be it disgust or intrigue or both, is a direct result of the war on drugs. I know how romantic drugs were staged to appear in my mind. The public service announcements let us all know that something was there, just out of reach on the top shelf. Something that the adults in the room kept telling us to stay away from while providing vague responses to our questions. When our friends began using drugs and were not immediately rewarded with the brain damage promised by our school drug enforcement officers, many of us called bullshit and began to experiment along with them. And here's where the road gets bumpy in a culture of prohibition. Our parents don't talk to us, except to say, "Don't use drugs, okay, Ben?" Our authority figures shortchange us with fear-filled metaphors. "Don't forget, your brain is like an egg frying when you use drugs." And our spiritual leaders conflate our chemical consumption with sin and temptation, the stuff of Satan's lures. From many sides, we are bombarded with messages telling us that if we want to experiment with drugs, we ought to keep it to ourselves. And so we do. Or rather, we keep it within our small group of friends, fellow users and dealers who supply us with drugs, but not much information. We don't speak the truth to our support networks because we know that their response will put the blame back on us for any damage that comes from our drug use, financial, relational, spiritual, or legal. There's little space in such discussions for one to express the positive sides of drug use, the way that years of anxiety and depression can melt away with a bump of cocaine or a shot of morphine. Even when our mental, emotional, and sometimes physical health lead directly to our consumption, our discussions are restricted to negative effects of using, nearly all of which are the result not of the drugs we use, but of the culture in which we consume them. We are humans trying to treat something that doesn't feel quite as good as it should, and we are usually just fine so long as our drug supply is stable and safe. We don't get in trouble when we use drugs, we get in trouble when we run out of drugs. This podcast is about making that connection. Drugs can be dangerous if used irresponsibly, and I do not encourage anyone to haphazardly embark on psychotic journeys without first preparing, both spiritually and informationally. But the way we treat some drugs causes those of us that use them to suffer tremendously, from jail to disease to relationships lost at the ultimatums of tough love. The list at the beginning of this episode bears witness to the ways that U.S. culture is designed to force drug users into dangerous behavior. There's little empathy in these discussions, and when it appears, it's usually drowned out by a chorus of fear and loathing. But my personal experience, as well as the recent policy updates of countries around the world, has shown us that when users and addicts have access to clean and cheap drugs, and when they can't be arrested for possessing or using them, more often than not, we simply reduce our use, and frequently we stop using outright. But so long as drugs remain illegal, prisons will remain packed with drug dealers, while drug cartels and local drug dealers will continue making billions of dollars outside the law. Drug users will keep being charged 1,000% markups for polluted products, and, relatedly, we will keep catching diseases and overdosing. Drug users and suppliers are the only casualties in the war on drugs. Our eradication is its main objective. Nobody really thinks we can ever get people to stop using drugs. We've been at it for more than 100 years, trying all sorts of increasingly cruel methods of prohibition, and we've had no success. Yet the war rages on. Back in the day, 20 years ago, when I started using the then illegal drug cannabis, my hooks were depression and anxiety, along with some other conditions related to my spiritual and emotional well-being. I spent a few years stuck in the muck of blah, under the heavy blanket of depression that drags behind you like Pigpen's permanent mess. If you've ever been there, you know the place I mean, and if you haven't, I hope you never go. At the time, I didn't have the language to label my depression or anxiety, let alone the tools to treat them. I was only 15 years old. Plus, I grew up in a charismatic Christian household. I lived in a world where mental illness of any sort was seen as a demonic attack, best defeated by prayer and supplication, not by appeal to man's invented field of psychobabble. But when I used marijuana, I noted that, among other things, my social phobias disappeared and my anxiety and depression fogged over. They didn't exactly go away. That was the work of therapy and mindfulness, which I didn't discover until years later. But they did become manageable. It was like wearing a pair of image-sharpening glasses. Things just felt more connected and predictable. Little could throw me into the previously unavoidable spirals of anxiety that had become the meshwork of my daily existence. I was, in a manner of speaking, free for the first time in my life. But there was a big problem. Drugs were both illegal and sinful. Plus, as far as I knew, they caused some sort of brain damage or liver failure or insanity or immorality. I wasn't really sure what I was supposed to believe. These competing narratives caused me profound psychological damage as I attempted to carry them both at the same time. I believed, to some degree, that my marijuana use would likely result in my tragic death by the age of 30, another good kid destroyed by drug use. The lies I had been told caused me to act irresponsibly because they worked, because I believed them to some degree. I want to take a minute to explain the brain fucking that takes place when somebody begins self-medicating with an illegal drug in a culture of prohibition. Prior to that point, I was just a normal 15-year-old kid, but the second I began consuming marijuana and other drugs, I was a criminal. Before, a police officer was a good guy who I could flag down for help in an emergency. But as soon as I began smoking, when I wasn't even old enough to drive, I became a criminal. I saw the police as a threat, as soldiers in a war against me and the chemical which I needed to perform at my best. And that threat was not just in my head. For in 11th grade, I was arrested for smoking weed outside my school building before class. From that point on, I was a real criminal, not just in theory, but on paper. Any drug user who lives in a place where their drug is illegal can relate. If you don't allow your drug use to preoccupy your day, then you risk the chance of exposure and arrest. You risk your very freedom. The day I started self-medicating, I could no longer leave my house without thinking ahead. What do I do with my weed if I get pulled over? How much should I take? Where can I smoke it and not be detected? It's painfully ironic in hindsight that many of my classmates were medicating just as often as I was, but they were using legal drugs prescribed by their doctor, so they could use them anywhere they pleased. My speed-swallowing and barbiturate-taking friends had nothing to worry about if we were pulled over because their drugs were in a brown bottle issued from a pharmacy, while I might well wind up in jail from a joint plucked from a backyard plant. My point is that the war on drugs creates criminals from otherwise law-abiding citizens. The system was designed in such a way that it can't work any differently so long as drugs remain illegal and users arrestable. Cognitive dissonance is something that U.S. citizens are usually really good at performing, but in this case it was too much to envision police as both good guys and bad guys at the same time. The truth is that they would take me to jail the second they knew that I was making myself feel better by using medication that wasn't approved. They were my enemy because the second I stopped thinking about them that way, I was liable to wind up locked up. Like many drug users, I embraced the dark side. I became the criminal and subsequently the addict I had been told I would become. And instead of the people around me recognizing the system was designed to virtually guarantee this outcome, they blamed me. The world around me, including my friends, my family, my church, my school, the local law enforcement, set upon a mission to rid society of my disgusting habit of treating my depression with a garden weed. In the process, they turned me to the underworld, the only place where I could obtain my drugs, where I only dove deeper into unhealthy and irresponsible drug consumption. The drugs never caused me any damage. My irresponsible use in a culture at war with addicts nearly cost me my life. Drug addicts don't choose the bodies we're born into, nor the brains we find ourselves operating, any more than anyone else. We get what we get. That said, having the brain and body of a drug addict has turned out to be an incredible gift, to borrow a religious term. But I didn't know it back then. I'd been trained to believe something sinister about addicts, and I believed it about myself. Back then, if I could have switched bodies with a non-addicted person, I would have done so in a second. Now, I wouldn't trade it for the world. I recognized the benefits of cannabis use early in my life, and that meant that I was both a criminal and an addict in the eyes of those around me, so long as I continued using. My friends disappeared, replaced by a group of people who, much like myself, were seeking relief from something that wasn't quite right, and trying to avoid the police in the process. Thus my street education began, a junkie on the south side of Battle Creek, Michigan. From there, as I'll talk about in most episodes, I ran headlong into a world of uneducated narcotic bliss. I used every drug I could get my hands on, many of them incorrectly, and I ended up physically addicted to a few. Opioids, namely fentanyl, heroin, and oxycodone, and cocaine via mainline injection. From here, the story usually goes one way for poor people in a culture of prohibition, and I was no exception. Our drugs, which cost a few bucks to produce, are illegal, so they're expensive and hard to find. Our lives become consumed with finding our next fix and coming up with enough cash to secure it. No doctors are involved, just the local dope man who stands to lose his livelihood if we seek treatment or try to reduce our intake. I was in and out of jail for 5 years before I wound up in state prison for around 18 months. In 2004, I was arrested in a big box store when security recognized me from a heist a few weeks earlier. The arresting officer confiscated nearly 24 stolen pieces of identity, social security cards, driver's licenses, and credit cards I had been using to illegally purchase merchandise for months, which I would in turn sell on the streets or trade directly to my drug dealer. In the end, I was lucky to get dozens of felony charges reduced to just 3 related to stolen property. I spent just over a year in prison before being paroled. But the emotional trauma I was struggling with when I headed into prison only got worse, and by the time I got out, it was nearly inevitable that I would turn back to drugs for support, the only tool I had received that had ever worked. A late-night DUI charge landed me in the hospital with 20 stitches in my face, and then back in prison with another 3 months added to my sentence. It was only through methadone, a drug that I didn't even know existed throughout most of my heroin addiction, that I was able to eventually work my way off of heavy opioids, slowly and methodically developing tricks and skills along the way to cope with the issues in my life which had before been doused in dope. I'm not clean and sober. That black and white dichotomy is one of the many false binaries I hope to chip away at in this podcast. 12-step programs work great for many people, and they should be free to use those programs if they make their lives better. But for those of us who find such programs distasteful or unhelpful for any number of reasons, our options ought to be publicly addressed and openly discussed. But too often this is not the case, and we're told that addicts are either clean and sober or relapsing. There's no such thing as responsible drug use or life-enhancing dependency in our socially sanctioned narratives, but there can be, and there should be. I got out of prison for the final time in 2006. Just over a decade later, I completed my PhD in communication, which is worth spending a moment on. Communication is a field of academia that is so misunderstood that many of my students don't know what their major really is. When asked to describe it, they clam up and shrug their shoulders. Communication happens between people in many ways, some more effective than others. But as a field of study, communication acts as a network. It's our job to act as a central hub where theory meets history meets application. Communication scholars connect the dots that are right in front of people all along, but that they haven't quite recognized as connected, or sometimes even as dots. This means that we're swervers. We move from topic to topic, providing a basic groundwork to entice listeners into following through with their own research. We offer tidbits and previews of what a field of study holds for those who might seek out its treasures. When you hear an author like Malcolm Gladwell connect biology, history, literature, physics, and religion, you've witnessed the work of a genius communication scholar. We tempt you to follow up and research more on the areas that you find most interesting, and we do so by pointing out genealogical connections, links between the past and the present, between science and religion, between genetics and biology. We are compasses on a map of knowledge that gets bigger every year. Our job is to guide those looking for messages to the places where they can find them. I'm not a biologist or neurologist, a lawyer, or a medical doctor by trade. But in any given episode, you'll likely hear me wear all of these hats and sometimes more. As a doctor of communication, that's kind of my job. Truth be told, a neurologist could explain what happens in your brain when you use drugs much better than I could. But the language of neurology is such that most of us wouldn't understand, in some cases myself included. As you follow up on some of the things you hear in this podcast, you're likely to encounter the same language barrier. The neurologist will discuss the operations of synapses using terms that force you to Google them and then to dive deeper into descriptions of yet more terms. The historian might send you on a goose chase trying to understand what they meant when they referenced Queen so-and-so, or a war that you never heard of. An astrophysicist will speak beyond the comprehensions of the human mind, describing billions of years and speeds that warp space-time. Again, you may find yourself stuck in Alice's rabbit hole. It's not that these folks are assholes who are trying to confuse us regular Joes. On the contrary, they're trying to communicate just like we are. And once you reach a certain level of expertise, you have to utilize specialized terms and theories to complete your education and to add to that body of knowledge that already exists within your field. Every one of us has probably used a specialized term from work or school to describe something to our families, only to receive a puzzled look. Anytime humans gather in groups to focus on a communal goal, they develop shortcuts for communicating, specialized terms to describe otherwise wordy things quickly and efficiently. One of the goals of the communication researcher is to drop all of that knowledge on you in a way that doesn't leave your head spinning. I can't offer you everything there is to know about most subjects because I don't understand everything there is to know, but I know enough to point you in the right direction when it comes to responsible use, and my goal is to get that information to those that need it. It's no exaggeration to say that some of our lives are on the line. In the past, fear and misinformation spoon-fed to citizens through DARE campaigns and public service announcements may have actually prevented a few of us from using drugs out of pure ignorance and fear. But those very few scared straight arrows will soon be a thing of the past. They may be extinct already. The reason is ease of access to information. When I was growing up, This Is Your Brain on Drugs commercials were presented in a vacuum of knowledge. It was difficult to dig up a bunch of information about drugs, even if you were curious. The anti-drug warriors had a monopoly on public knowledge, and they used it to spread lies. But we no longer live in that world. We are at a cultural tipping point. The information age and its partner, the era of fake news, guarantee that information of all sorts is easily available to anyone willing to spend a few minutes searching Reddit blogs. The fact that many of the tips provided in online forums are incorrect and sometimes even dangerous only adds urgency to this project of education. We have to begin talking openly and honestly about drugs and drug users. Throughout my education, more than one mentor along the way advised me to focus on a specialty, to become well-versed in one thing. As a drug addict, I figured I should focus on what I'd always been interested in: drugs. The junkie in me believed I had a head start. I'd been on the street shooting, snorting, swallowing, and smoking anything I could get my hands on for years, and I'd spent a good deal of that time physically and emotionally dependent on heroin. It seemed like I could write a dissertation without doing much research at all. Boy, was I wrong. Early into the project, I realized that I didn't know very much about drugs at all. I didn't know how they worked in the body. I didn't know how to use them. I'm lucky to have survived many of the dangerous methods I was using to produce and ingest drugs. And I didn't know where they came from or how they made their way to my neighborhood drug dealer. So I began to read and to listen. I learned the language of academia, and I obtained a passport into the sacred halls of the Ivory Tower, including the coveted information vault where one can bring up nearly any paper published at the click of a button, all from the comfort of a home office. And to be honest, I nearly gave up, because the language barrier I discussed a minute ago is everywhere. You can't talk to these people without scratching your head. They speak a different language, or so I thought. But I was forced to learn it, and I speak it rather fluently now, although I prefer to wobble back and forth between it and the dialect of the streets. My dissertation eventually evolved into a historical mapping, or a genealogy, of the war on drugs throughout early United States history. A war which was spearheaded by politicians who played on the racial animosity of white United States citizens in the shadows of the Civil War and the subsequent so-called Reconstruction. But my notes about how drugs worked and what they did in the body continued to pile up, and I filed them alongside my personal journals and reflections from my deepest days of drug use. These pieces of the puzzle did not make the final cut in my dissertation, called Discourses of Deception, Re-examining America's War on Drugs. You can check it out with a Google search for free if you're curious about how politicians managed to start a war in a time of peace. Once it was published, I felt like I had to do something with all of the leftover notes, all of the work I had put in, both using drugs and studying them. But life got busy. I got my first job in nearly 15 years, as a college professor of all things, so I filed the notes away and let a year go by, and then 2. In those 2 years, more than 125,000 U.S. citizens died of a drug overdose. I woke up to that number flashing through my mind a few months back, 125,000 deaths, and as a mainlining cocaine and heroin junkie, I somehow managed to avoid being listed among them. But all my people had not drawn as lucky a straw as I had. How many more might die while this information gathers dust in my file cabinet, I asked myself. How many of them might be my friends, or your family members? Then, as I prepared to launch this project, COVID-19 hit, forcing us all to stay away from our support groups. The perfect storm is already underway for that number to shoot yet higher. It's time to talk openly and honestly about drugs. They're not sinful or poison. Those of us who use them are not weak, and we don't lose our moral compass and begin committing heinous crimes under the influence. We just live our lives as best we can. Using heroin made me the nicest person I've ever been. I was never infuriated, and I often didn't get bothered over small stuff at all. But when the $100 a day price tag ate up my savings account, and when my job fired me because drug users are persona non grata in capitalism, I found myself as desperate for heroin as Jean Valjean had been for bread. It was the sustenance I needed to get through the day. For those that have never been addicted to anything that is in limited supply, imagine the feeling that we call thirst, combined with the feeling that we call horny, and add an anxiety attack that slowly but steadily ramps up with each passing hour. This is a glimpse into what opiate withdrawal feels like. Well, that, plus you're shitting your pants, vomiting, sweating, and sick. You're a straight up hot mess. This description should make clear one thing I'm not trying to do with this podcast. I'm not encouraging anyone to use drugs. But I also know, personally and socially, that nobody can stop people from getting high. Humans have been doing it for as long as we've been humans. The United States, the world's gun-toting bully, launched a straight-up war against drugs and drug users more than 100 years ago, and drugs are more common on the streets today than they were shortly after the war began. We must begin encouraging responsible drug use. I cannot sit idly by as another year passes, as another 65,000 drug users wind up in graves and the war wages on. We can do better. We have to do better. This podcast is dedicated to that mission. Too late for Melissa, or for Max, or for Gary, or for Kelly, but maybe early enough to save the life of someone close to you. My hope is that this serves as a lighthouse for those who feel like they're unable to fit the social mold that's been offered to them. Drugs are not to be taken lightly, and they're not for everyone. But they are for many of us, and most of us take them every day to better our lives. You might be drinking a hot cup of drugs right now, or perhaps planning a smoke break later when you'll consume some drugs. Drugs are not deadly chemicals that bring us ever closer to our ultimate demise. For some of us, they're quality of life enhancers, palliative remedies to our anxious hearts. Our cultural refusal to discuss them in this light has led us to our current position of desperation. Piles of bodies in prisons and morgues bear witness to our ignorant mistake. Addiction is not a death sentence, it's just a label to help us understand ourselves. What we attach to that label as a culture is optional and updatable. Drug users need not wind up in prison or on the streets. We can survive and we can thrive, but that only happens when we start talking openly and honestly about drugs. Together, we can lift the fog. Join me for real talk about the things that get you high this season on the Dr. Junkie Show.
The After Episode Detox.
If you're a fan of Easter eggs and video games or hidden tracks on 1990s alternative rock CDs, you'll probably enjoy the After Episode Detox segment. But if you or someone you know is detoxing from the drug we've been discussing in the episode, this is definitely the place for you. Withdrawal sucks, and on some drugs, it's straight up brutal. This quick section will provide tips for detoxing, things to do to help you get through the worst that detox has to throw your way. I've decided to place this section at the end for somewhat obvious reasons. Detox comes at the end of a drug session, but also so that it can be quickly accessed when you're considering using a drug, or in the unlikely event that you forgot to do your research ahead of time and are freaking out, crashing right now, and need some advice. Since this is episode 1, your detox symptoms can be easily remedied by playing the next episode. You may be hooked already, but the only side effects of the Dr. Junkie Show are whoa moments and occasional arguments with family members and friends who think that drug users are bad people. Aside from that, you'll be just fine. Love the addicts in your life, and if you are an addict, love yourself. Take some time to think about what this sort of love is, what it looks like. It isn't tough or scared. It's compassionate and sympathetic. It meets us addicts where we're at, and it helps us plan for the future without judgment. And often, it's the only difference between addicts and drug users who are successful in life and those of us who wind up dead or locked up because of the war on drugs. Let's work together to change the fate of drug users in the United States.